It goes without saying that Kyousougiga is incredibly influenced by Japanese folklore and religious practice. It is also inspired to a palpable degree by Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, a relation I hope to cover more deeply in the future. Folklore is a difficult term to define, even if most of us have a fairly good sense of what someone is talking about when they refer to folklore. Very broadly, and in deep relation to the concept of tradition, we can think of folklore as a sort of all-encompassing creative continuity, a concept that has roots in the past but is intrinsically transformable according to the imagination of those in the present. After all, this morphing of narratives, characterizations, and appearances is, for the most part, what drives the development of new stories and new ideas. The folklore of the world, if that notion makes sense, is generally the pool from which inspiration is drawn from, or at least what it can be traced back to. Nothing is completely original. But to get to Japan in particular, a very large part of folklore, not just in Japan, is the desire to explain the small unknowns, like what causes milk to go bad or why children go missing from villages. This idea can be nicely mirrored with religion, which could be characterized as a desire to explain the contrastingly large unknowns. The stories of folklore exist in an interstitial space, a visceral, close space. It is said that twilight, the boundary between day and night, is the best opportunity for one to come into contact with yokai, and indeed, many yokai are described as active during twilight. Before we continue, what is a yokai? Yokai is a broad concept that has existed under different popular names in Japan since before the 8th century. Yokai have been categorized in many different ways as well, but a comparative idea of yokai I quite like is that yokai are just kami, that is, spirits or gods that are not worshipped, and subsequently, kami are just yokai that are worshipped. And indeed, folkloristic creatures and phenomena like yokai generally do not project the idea that they are either powerful enough or benevolent enough to warrant being worshipped. Nonetheless, there are numerous examples of yokai connected in some way to deities, in particular Inari and his or her or its kitsune messengers. Yokai carries with it the connotation of a trickster, but at the same time yokai can also be very good or completely evil. They can be thought of as creatures with form, as is common today, or merely as strange, abstract phenomena. Yokai can similarly serve as embodiments of human fears, as in the case of the oni or demon. What is constant is their existence in the liminal space, regardless of whether that interstice is far from human settlements or in the home itself. This makes sense because, as I said earlier, the majority of yokai are created to explain or protect against the little unknowns, and those unknowns are always within the scope of daily life. Alice, juxtaposed against folkloristic stories, is set in completely different worlds that touch our own in such a way that they may as well not exist for us. Alice is built on concentrated nonsense, and while I and many others have extracted some educational and moralistic value from it, it's certainly written primarily to entertain rather than to explain or teach. In Kyousougiga, Alice contributes mainly to the narrative, while Japanese folk tradition and imagination feeds the aesthetics. Kyousougiga definitely feels Japanese, but both lines of inspiration feed its yokai. Yasedoji is the most obvious example. As the leading yokai in Kyousougiga, she is the main character to discuss regarding Kyousougiga's monsters. She exists at an interstice of characterization. She is full of juxtaposition. Most obviously, her attire is completely based off the female fashion of Carol's time period, and her whimsical tea parties are a callback to the famous tea party in Chapter 7 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Her attire and affections are the very picture of a well-dressed, well-behaved English lady. But I don't need to remind anyone of her violent outbursts and demonic nature. Her name, Yasedoji, is quite interesting as well, and I believe there are two threads of inspiration for it. Firstly, there is in Kyoto a mountain and an area surrounding it called Yase, and in this area work the Yasedoji, who are best known for being the traditional bearers of the emperor's coffin at his funeral. Doji can be translated as child, boy, or servant. The other line of inspiration, also relating to the word doji, is the famous legend of Shuten Doji, an oni who lived in the mountains northwest of Kyoto. In this way, the suffix doji simultaneously alludes to her demonic nature, her childish demeanor, and her connection to the city of Kyoto. While most oni are male, especially today, in classical Japan, stories of female oni were not uncommon. Most often, these oni would be characterized by excessive jealousy or passion, especially of a sexual nature, which had caused them to transform into a demon and commit further acts of evil. This interdependence between strong human emotion and inhuman nature ties in very clearly with Yase, and the overbearing affection she has for Lady Koto can be seen as Kyousougiga's unique take on the classic characterization of female oni. Yase is, of course, the leader of a large group of yokai in the Looking Glass City, most of whom are based off of existing yokai. This could be another allusion to Shuten Doji, who was a leader of yokai as well. It also brings to mind the hyakki yagyō, parades of yokai and demons through the streets of Japanese towns, notably Kyoto. Hyakki yagyō literally means night procession of 100 demons. A bit later on, in the 1400s, painted scrolls depicting hyakki yagyō would be drawn, and many have a clear relation to the Kyousougiga scrolls. The oni would appear during the night, and the sun would signal the end of their march. It's fitting then that Yase's transformations never occur in the sunlight. When they were first conceived, the hyakki yagyō were to be feared, and merely looking at one was said to be a good way to lose your life. But by the time they were being drawn on scrolls, many had a comedic, light-hearted tone about them. A and Un are yokai as well. They, like Yase, adhere to a very important notion in yokai-related subject matter, transformation. Although it's debatable what exactly their animal forms are, I'm of the opinion that they take inspiration primarily from kitsune. They, along with Ne and Ko, serve as messengers and aides to Inari and the shrine, and it's also worth mentioning that the shrine has kitsune statues, leading me to believe that the shrine is based on the central Inari shrine in Kyoto. These kitsune statues are derivatives of the lion dog statues that guard the entrances to many Shinto shrines, one with its mouth open for A and the other with its mouth closed for Un. Even Lady Koto can be seen as a yokai, and again she draws inspiration from both the East and Alice. Of course, Lady Koto as a rabbit is a clear reference to the white rabbit who first leads Alice to the rabbit hole. She similarly leads Inari towards love and is, as I've said in my other videos, fundamentally connected to the Looking Glass City, our Alice-esque realm. However, she is also inspired by the myth of the moon rabbit, a legend that has its roots in Buddhism and has propagated through Oriental countries in various forms. The legend, to be brief, tells of a rabbit who throws itself onto a fire to feed a Buddhist deity disguised as an ascetic. The rabbit does not burn, however, and is instead rewarded for its virtue by having its image impressed on the moon. Importantly, this rabbit is described to be a prior incarnation of a bodhisattva. Now, let's switch gears and talk about the more abstract concepts of interstices and other worlds, ideas which Kyousougiga uses extensively. At the beginning of the video, I emphasized the differences between yokai folklore existing in a liminal space and Alice's setting in a completely different world. Kyousougiga makes explicit reference to both these ideas right in its introduction. But there is a fundamental difference between the world of the Looking Glass City and that of Carol's Wonderland and Looking Glass worlds. The city was painted by Inari. Every aspect of the city is deliberate, and everything that ever changes the city is not born of the city itself. The Carolian worlds, in contrast, are chaotic and unknown, at least from the viewpoint of Alice. In Kyousougiga, Koto perceives the Looking Glass City in much the same way Alice perceives Wonderland, but Koto has an agency that Alice lacks. Alice, at many times, plays as an observer to the strange happenings around her, but Koto is far more involved, destroying buildings without a tama and eventually causing the destruction of the city entirely. The Looking Glass City, taken on its own, is a setting where a perpetual hyakki yagyō is taking place. Kyousougiga plays with the ideas of human and inhuman spaces by simultaneously separating the Looking Glass City from the other realms, but also dissolving the barrier between human and yokai within it. The people of the Looking Glass City have a fundamentally different relationship with yokai, that of coexistence. But alongside that coexistence comes stagnation. In reality, yokai are constantly being created, changed, and reinvented. A large part of why this happens is because yokai live on the mysterious boundaries of human life. They constantly morph because of their association with the unknown. But in the Looking Glass City, The perpetual hyakki yagyō negates any need for change. The nature of the hyakki yagyō of antiquity as discrete events was integral to their mysterious, interesting status in the minds of the folk. When something integrates into the realm of constancy and familiarity, it becomes uninteresting. No one who lives in the city expresses a sense of wonder at the yokai that live alongside them. It's just part of their lives. There's no mysteries to be explored in the city because the yokai, the embodiments of mystery, are right alongside them all the time. And of course, we can see this stagnation most clearly in the constant regeneration of everything that is broken in the city. Importantly, it's in the final episodes when the Looking Glass City experiences its apocalypse, arguably the greatest change that can happen to a world, that suddenly nothing is fixing itself. For me, this brings to mind the Tolkienian gift of man, mortality. To continue, the checkerboard cutouts and CGI shapes that roam the city and the skies above it are reminiscent of the word yokai's older association with phenomena rather than creatures. Within their whimsical, non-intrusive portrayal is the loss of the sense of purpose that the concept of yokai have in the real world. Yokai in the Looking Glass City are, essentially, just part of the landscape. And while we as viewers following Koto are intended to view the Looking Glass City with a sense of wonder, it's not hard to see why Kurama loathes the city so much. It's fitting that his opinion from childhood hasn't changed. Nothing ever changes here. There's irony then that in creating such a spectacular and strange city, Inari robs that very excitement from those who live within it. While the real world can sustain a sense of wonder precisely because we don't know everything about it, the Looking Glass City's lack of self-contained mysteries makes it dull. Even Lady Koto, drawn as the god of the Looking Glass City, exists somewhat separately from it because of the Bodhisattva. If she had not interacted with the Bodhisattva, she would have never done the things that she did with Inari. Yokai in many ways represent the human personification of the unknown. When the gap between yokai and humans is bridged, as it is in the Looking Glass City, the wonder and the mystery of everyday life fades. And it's only when an external entity, Koto, enters the city do things become exciting again. To conclude, Kyousougiga does not simply draw heavily from Japanese folklore. It also synthesizes, transforms, and subverts various threads of thought within folk stories to achieve a narrative and symbolic depth that underlies the relative simplicity of its surface messages. This is not only within the spirit of folk tradition, but also speaks to the creativity of Matsumoto and her team. I've compared the worlds of the Looking Glass City and our reality to reinforce that yokai are interesting and inspiring precisely because they are impossible to completely categorize and characterize. There are many, many other lines of thought to be pursued with regard to the world of Kyousougiga, but what I've tried to do here is relate it to the intrinsic reasons why yokai are created and sustained by the people of Japan.